Joshua 4 records Israel's passage through the Jordan and the setting up of 12 stones as a memorial. The chapter is not merely about a geographical crossing, but about the transition from an old condition into a new reality established by God's faithfulness. The river stood as a barrier that could not be overcome through human effort, yet the waters were cut off when the ark entered the Jordan. This reveals that God Himself accomplishes the passage into inheritance, rest, and covenant blessing. The ark remained in the midst of the river while the people crossed safely. The focus is not upon the strength or obedience of Israel, but upon the presence of God securing the way for them. The priests stood firmly until every person had crossed over, showing the completeness of God's work. Nothing was left unfinished. The people did not partially enter the land. They crossed entirely because the way had been established for them. The 12 stones taken from the Jordan served as a witness that the impossible had already been overcome. The stones were carried from the place of death and impossibility into the land of promise. In this sense, the memorial testified that what once separated the people from inheritance no longer held power over them. Israel was to remember that God had brought them through what they could never conquer by themselves. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan where the priests stood. This detail emphasizes that the place of impossibility had been permanently marked by God's intervention. The river that once threatened death became the location of testimony and victory. The memory of the crossing was intended to shape the identity of future generations. They were not to see themselves as abandoned wanderers, but as a people who had already been brought into covenant fulfillment. The chapter repeatedly stresses remembrance. The children would later ask, "What do these stones mean?" And the answer would declare the mighty work of God. Faith was to be rooted in what God had accomplished rather than in human striving. The memorial stones proclaimed grace because they pointed away from human ability and toward divine accomplishment. The drying up of the Jordan parallels the earlier crossing of the Red Sea. Both events revealed that salvation and deliverance come from God alone. Israel did not part the waters by discipline, wisdom, or effort. The waters fled before the presence of God. This theme runs throughout Scripture. What humanity cannot accomplish, God freely performs. The crossing into the land also points to the end of wandering. The wilderness represented instability, uncertainty, and dependence upon external regulations to govern a people who had not yet entered rest. Crossing the Jordan symbolized entering into a settled inheritance. The emphasis is not on earning access, but on receiving what God had promised long before. The fear that came upon the surrounding nations after the crossing demonstrated the supremacy of God's kingdom over earthly powers. The nations recognized that the God of Israel had done what no idol or ruler could accomplish. The miracle testified publicly that God's covenant purposes could not be stopped by natural obstacles. Joshua 4 ultimately presents a message of completed passage. The people were not standing on the edge of promise, wondering whether God would accept them. They had already crossed because God Himself made the way. The memorial stones stood as lasting witnesses that the barrier had been removed, the passage had been secured, and the people now lived in the reality of what God had accomplished on their behalf.